everybody. This is a test video and officially my first ever video on this channel. Today we'll be taking a look at a short history of Ireland by Sean McMahon. This is it's a history book, of course, that I picked up from a thrift store for around $3. And it highlights the history of Ireland in a actually quite a short manner. The book itself is not very long. It is only about 200 pages long, and it will go through the entirety of the creation of Ireland to to modern day, because Ireland is still here, obviously. And so, yeah, we're going to go ahead and read a little bit of this today as a test video, and then later on I will be reading the rest of it, hopefully. It'll be a long series because I can't sit and read a book in one sitting, especially a 200-page book, but we'll see how long it takes. So a little bit of background about this channel is that I will be doing pretty much only history-related content. I'm using it as a way to push myself to read these books, to learn history, as it is my major in college. And I want to further my knowledge, and hopefully it'll be interesting for you guys to listen to also. So yeah, I have many history books that I can be reading on this channel. Many of these books, once we read some of these books. Okay, so let's go through the contents of the book first. So we start chapter 1, the Winter Island. Then we go to chapter 2, Christian Ireland. Chapter 3, Vikings and High Kings. Chapter 4, the Creek in Bagabun. The Creek of Bagabun, my bad. Chapter 5, Hibernicis, Ipsis, some language I do not understand and cannot pronounce. I assume it is Gaelic, Old Gaelic. Then we go to chapter 6, the Tudor Queen and Gaelic Prince. Chapter 7, Planter, Gael, and Jacobite. Chapter 8, the very definition of slavery. Chapter 9, the Boys of Wexford. Chapter 10, King of the Beggars. Chapter 11, Farm and Factory. Chapter 12, Home Rule, Rome Rule. Chapter 13, Fights for Freedom. Chapter 14, it's another foreign language that I don't even know where to start. That is probably more like, it's more of a modern Gaelic. And then chapter 15, Dreary Spires, a chronology of Irish history, which is after that, which is not a chapter. Then select bibliography, and then an index. Alright, we have chapter 1, the Winter Island. It was Gaius Julius Caesar who on paper at least divided all Gaul into 3 parts, that first recorded Ireland's name as Hibernia, the winter place. His 2 hurried visits across the English Channel in 55 BC and 54 BC did no more than establish a domain of interest. The conquest of Britain and southern Scotland was left to Claudius and others. By AD 82, the Eagle had established itself as far north of the Solway, Firth, and County Antrim was less than a day's journey away. The Gubernator Britannia, Gnaeus Julius Agricola, was on the point of a narrow sea invasion with ships and armies primed villages that existed before the rise of sea levels that followed the end of the last ice age, 10,000 BC, established it and its neighbors as islands and no longer part of the main. With the slow increase in temperature, the mosses that were the main vegetation of the tundra lands were transmogrified into hardwood trees, which grew in such abundance that the island, except for the wetlands of Bog Lake and river marges, became heavily afforested. The great elk died out then, some say because with their antlers 8 foot wide, it could not live in a forest, and the early inhabitants had to subsist on smaller mammals like wild pig and fish and game. They made spears and axes of flint and bone, and were nomadic to the extent that they had to follow their food. Archaeological evidence of the existence of these early people has been found at Mount Sandal near Coleraine in North County Derry, and at Loughborough in Offaly. With the coming of Christianity, the Irish at last found a means of making a written record of their early history. The model that they used was of a series of invasions going back to the time of Noah's flood. These are almost entirely mythical, but they may well reflect a folk memory of actual immigration and assimilation. The oldest document about these incursionists was the Liber Gabala, Book of Invasions, and it lists, among others, Fomorians, giant sea pirates who came from the islands of the north, Firbolg, and Milesians who hailed from Spain. The name Firbolg was could disguise the Belgae, who probably made their way to the south coast through the English Channel. The Hispanic origins of the Sons of Mel could well have been I've never even seen that word in my life. Euhemeristic version of an actual incursion from Iberia, and the Fomorian giants may have been a memory of early Scandinavian freebooters. The Irish Celts were curious not only about their own past, but also that their predecessors on the westerly island, they sought explanations for the megalithic remains, Tolman's Passage graves, and tumuli, especially those which dominated the fertile basin of Boyne, that they viewed with a religious awe. The special reverence and potency associated with Tara and Emain Maga, persisted into historical times, is part of the same process. The word Celts, Celtoi to the Greeks and Celtae to the Romans, may never have been used by the people themselves. The name was applied to a nomadic and warlike people who originated in South Central Europe, spread east and west. These warriors were equipped with iron weapons and fought battles on foot and from spiked-wheeled chariots. They attacked Delphi and sacked Rome, or were just as happy to fight with each other, preferring to maintain small, independent tribal units. They fought naked or in linen shirts and relied on individual bravery and noise to try to cow their enemies. Their Irish descendants continued to affect this armorless battle gear even against the invading Normans, who were protected by chainmail and had stirruped war horses. The Celts' fascination with those they perceived as their own particular ancestors seems positively Shintoist. They held in their imaginations a heroic age with epic warriors and conflicts and queens as powerful and independent as any king. The main question that confronts historians of this quasi-historical period is whether the waves of immigration, which archaeologists confirm were actual reoccurring conquests of the people of the last wave, or merely colonization of other parts of a fairly empty and heavily wooded land. The Celts have made the greatest impression because their characteristic artifacts, marked by rich and subtle design, are found all over Europe, but they may not have been even the largest group of finely homogeneous people, who, by the 5th century, could be called Gaels, and were to be the object of the attention of Christian missionaries. They had by then a common language, a version of Celtic that finally became Irish, Manx, and Gaelic. In this language they created, memorized, and passed down by word of mouth marvelous tales about what they held as their past. The great prose and verse epic Tain Bo Wallagane, which tells of an epic struggle between Connacht Med and Ulsters, called Jubar, and describes the death of Cuchulainn. My pronunciations are very wrong, by the way. It is very hard to pronounce these. Anyways, the greatest of the northern heroes may have its origin in the struggle which pushed the historical Ulaid east of the Ban. Aesthetics aside, the most significant thing about the epic is that a bull is at its center. The great Gaels of Ireland, and as Chesterton called them, may have been bonny fighters, but they were fighting farmers and stockmen. They were almost pathologically independent and isolated, each from the other, preferring small divisions of territory with settlements not unlike the ranch system of the early American West. The ring forts, which are to be found in great profusion all over the country, about 60,000 in all, and which were called fairy forts in more romantic times, are remains of these homesteads. 100 feet in diameter, the bank enclosed a circular yard with a dwelling and outhouses. The purpose of the ramp in simple dwellings was mainly as a perimeter mark and a defense against wild boar and wolves. Richer people, wealth, measured in terms of cattle, who felt more threatened, usually had triple ramparts with deep ditches in between. The grandest and oddest of all Gaelic dwellings was the Crannog, an artificial island built in the middle of a lake, reached either by boat or by specifically constructed and disposable causeway, which only the very rich could afford. The Irish proverb, I'm not even going to read that because I cannot. It's just a Irish proverb, let's just say that, belongs to a later social configuration. Those from the parts of the country where the Gaelic system was allowed to persist until Tudor times found towns created by Ulstermen and Normans and English intolerably claustrophobic and preferred to live as much as possible in the open air. The social and political, stumbled over my words there. The social and political unit was the Tuath, and at one period, from the 7th to the 8th century, when the total population of the island was less than 500,000, there were up to 200 of these tiny pastoral and agricultural entities. They were ruled by a king, whose main purposes were to supervise the local assembly and lead them to battle and act as a focus for quasi-religious respect. The Tuathum were usually part of a cluster governed by a over-king, larger groups, which became the basis for the episcopal dioceses, which were organized in the 12th century. These in turn formed themselves into major confederations. The 5/5 of England, Uliad, Mide, Lygan, Muma, and Connacht, the modern provincial division as Leinster, incorporating both Meath and Lagan, but the Irish word for province, not gonna say, is a mute reminder that the 4 provinces of Ireland once were 5. It still seems odd that a country the size of Ireland with a homogeneous social system and common language should have remained for millenniums so petulantly disunited. From time to time, charismatic leaders appear. The famous Niall of the 9 hostages, whom the older stories personally implicate in the snatch of Patrick, seems to have been a real person. He is taken to have come from Connacht and to have risen to great power because of successful freebooting raids on the west coast of Scotland and Britain. His direct descendants called themselves the Uí Niall, and by the 7th century they dominated the Midlands and North. The southern branch seized Tara, and by implication the right to nominate a king of all Ireland, just as the king who ruled the Tuath had specific and really limited powers. So no one took too much notice of the Uí Niall's claims except as a challenger. By the time of the firm establishment of Christianity, one can associate dominant dynasties with particular parts of the island. West Ulster was the territory of the northern. I'm just gonna call them the UN, the Uí Niall. It's easier to say UN. The UN, while east of the Ban, in present-day County Antrim, lived the descendants of the North's original inhabitants. The Ulaid, the North Midlands, was known as Ergiala, a name implying hostage-giving, while North Leinster, the most fertile part of the country, was southern UN territory. The land south of the Liffey to the southeast coast was ruled by Lagan, always a troublesome lot, as later centuries were to show. Munster was Connacht's territory with a site at Cashel as numinous as Tara, and the Cognac kings of the families Uí Fiachrak and Uí Briún. I really cannot pronounce this stuff. They claim descent from Niall's brothers, Brian, and Fiartra. Until the time of Mael Secnial, mid-9th century, no ruler, even of the UN, had made a formal effort to have himself declared King of Ireland, but the dynasty remained powerful for 3 centuries, and throughout that time, large tracts of the land of Ireland were under its control. Ironically, it was Brian Boru, a member of the obscure Tuath from what is now County Clare, who finally succeeded in becoming Imperator Scrotorum Scotorum. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there. I apologize for my pronunciations. They are very bad. This is mostly because I did not have any practice in pronouncing this language, which is Old Gaelic. So it's, it requires a specific pronunciation to be able to really get it right. It's got a very strong pronunciation. You can't just read it out as is, otherwise it sounds really weird. So, and I don't know how to pronounce it, therefore what I'm saying is most likely very wrong. So I apologize first and foremost for that. As I continue on to this book, I will make sure beforehand to take a look at pronunciations. Maybe search up on Google, figure out how to pronounce this type of stuff, or just really how to pronounce all the Gaelic words in general, so I can get a sort of a sound for them. But other than that, yeah, that's about it. I hope you guys sort of enjoyed this one, and yeah, I'll catch you guys later in the next installment of this book. But the next video will probably not be about this